Dan gets his review on a Tuesday afternoon. He's been at the company for 6 years. Senior project manager, consistently strong ratings. The kind of employee whose name comes up when something difficult needs handling, when a client is unhappy, when a deadline has collapsed, and someone needs to hold the pieces together. He's the person they call. He knows it. They know it. And yet, when he sits down across from his manager, Claire, the number she puts on the table is fine. A 3% increase. Inflation plus a little. He nods, says, "Thank you," and walks back to his desk. He doesn't say what he's thinking. What he's thinking is, this is the 4th year in a row the number has been fine. That evening, he opens a spreadsheet. Not a work one. A personal one he's been quietly building for almost 2 years, adding to it in small increments. The way you might track something you're not entirely sure what to do with yet. Market salary data pulled from compensation surveys. LinkedIn job postings filtered by role, seniority, and city. A few numbers shared in confidence by former colleagues who left, people who moved on and were suddenly, noticeably less guarded about what they earned. He stares at the gap between what the market pays for his role and what he currently makes. It isn't a small gap. It isn't a rounding error or a regional quirk. It's somewhere between 18 and 23%, depending on the company and the data source. He checks the numbers twice, then he closes the laptop. He doesn't know what to do with that number yet. But he doesn't forget it either. If this is already making you think about your own paycheck, you're not alone. And this channel exists to give you the financial clarity that nobody hands you at work. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video that could literally change what you earn. Most employees grow up inside a particular story about how salary works. The story goes like this: work hard, get recognized, earn more. Performance is rewarded. Loyalty is rewarded. Show up, deliver results, and the number on your paycheck will reflect that over time. And for the first few years of a career, that story isn't entirely wrong. Early raises do tend to track performance reasonably closely. A strong first year gets you 5%. An exceptional second year gets you more. The system appears to be functioning exactly as described. You believe in it because you've seen it work. But somewhere around year 3 or 4, sometimes sooner, sometimes later, something shifts. The raises keep coming, but they stop feeling like movement. 3%, 3.5%, sometimes 4%, in a good year, with a strong review and a manager who went to bat for you. The numbers feel like maintenance, not momentum. And no matter how strong the performance rating, no matter how clearly the feedback says outstanding or exceeds expectations, the ceiling doesn't seem to move. What most employees never realize, and what most companies have no structural incentive to explain, is that this isn't a performance problem. It never was. It's a design problem. The system is working exactly as it was built to work. The issue is that it wasn't built with your interests at the center. To understand why this happens, you need to understand how companies actually set pay. Organizations determine salaries through a mechanism called compensation banding. Every role sits inside a pay band, a defined floor, a midpoint, and a ceiling. That band is calibrated to external market data at the time it was established, which may have been 2 years ago or 4 or 6. It doesn't update automatically. It updates when HR runs a formal compensation review, which happens infrequently, incompletely, and almost never in your favor unless the company is actively struggling to recruit for your role from the outside. Within your band, performance determines where you sit. Strong reviews move you upward, from the lower third toward the midpoint, and eventually toward the top. But here's the structural trap that nobody names out loud. If you've been consistently strong for long enough, you eventually approach the ceiling of the band itself, not the ceiling of your ability, not the ceiling of your value to the organization. The ceiling of what the mathematical structure of the band is permitted to pay you. At that point, your annual raise no longer reflects your worth. It reflects the arithmetic of a system that has simply run out of room to move within its own constraints. You are at or near 100% of the midpoint the company has internally defined for your role. The system registers you as fully compensated, and so it stops pushing upward. It has, by its own logic, finished the job. This is precisely where Dan is sitting. He just doesn't have the vocabulary for it yet. Here's what makes the ceiling so difficult to see from the inside. Companies don't announce it. There is no meeting where your manager looks across the table and says, "I want you to know you've reached the top of your band. And until that band adjusts or your role changes, future raises will be marginal." That conversation almost never happens, not because managers are deliberately concealing something, but because most managers don't think in those terms either. They receive a budget, a percentage, a list of names. They distribute accordingly, and they do their best to frame it in a way that feels affirming. Great year, you're valued. Here's 3%. What happens instead is quieter and more corrosive. A series of fine reviews, fine numbers, and the slow, invisible accumulation of distance between what you earn and what the market would pay someone with your exact experience walking in from the outside as a new hire, yet with no history at the company, no accumulated raises, just a fresh offer priced at current market rates. That distance has a name in labor economics. It's called the loyalty penalty. And it is the measurable, documented cost of staying. Research consistently shows that employees who change companies every 2 to 3 years earn meaningfully more over a decade than employees who stay and rely on internal raises alone, not because they're more talented, not because they deliver better results, but because external hiring is priced against what the market currently bears, while internal raises are priced against a band that moves slowly, if it moves at all. Every year you stay, the gap between what you earn and what you'd earn elsewhere has the potential to widen, quietly, without anyone explicitly deciding to underpay you. It happens by default. It happens by design. The loyalty penalty is the structural consequence of a system optimized for cost containment, not fairness. Companies have a rational incentive to keep compensation predictable. A 3% annual raise costs a fraction of what a 20% market correction would require. And most employees, unaware that the gap exists, will accept the 3% without ever asking the harder question. Dan has been accepting it for 4 years. There's a second layer to this that goes beyond the band structure. It's about information, specifically about who holds it and who doesn't. When your manager sits down with you for a performance review, they typically know several things you don't. They know exactly where your salary sits within the band. They know the band's ceiling and how close you are to it. They know approximately what the market pays for your role because HR runs that analysis every time they recruit externally. Even if they never share those numbers with the people already in the seats, they know what it would cost to replace you, not just in salary, but in recruiting fees, onboarding time, and the months before a new hire reaches full productivity. You, sitting across the table, usually know none of this. You know your current number. You know last year's raise. You know whatever fragments you've managed to piece together from informal conversations, from job postings, from things people mentioned offhandedly at industry events. The information gap between you and your employer in that moment is not small. It is enormous. And that gap, more than any performance metric or manager relationship or company culture, always what determines the real outcome of a salary conversation. This is the same asymmetry that governs every high-stakes negotiation. The party with the most complete picture of the underlying reality holds the structural advantage. In salary conversations, that party is almost always the employer. Not because they're adversarial, not because they're acting in bad faith, but because the system was never designed to share that information proactively. Keeping it opaque is not a conspiracy. It's just the path of least resistance, and it happens to be very, very expensive for you. Dan begins to understand this not as an abstract idea, but as an operational reality when he starts treating his spreadsheet not as a curiosity, but as intelligence gathering. He gets specific, and he cross-references compensation data from multiple sources and looks for patterns, not just averages. He has direct conversations with people who recently made lateral moves and presses for actual numbers, not ranges. He maps his precise scope of responsibility against genuinely comparable roles at genuinely comparable companies, accounting for team size, budget authority, and complexity. He doesn't just look at what the job titles say, he looks at what the jobs actually require. By the time he has a number he trusts, he has something most employees never build: a documented, defensible, evidence-based market position. Not a feeling, not a hope, a number he can stand behind in a room. 3 months after that Tuesday review, an unsolicited message arrives in Dan's inbox. A recruiter at a competitor has found his profile. Then he takes the call, not with any firm intention to leave, but because he's curious, and because he's done the work to know what he's worth. The number they put forward is 21% above what he currently earns. He doesn't accept immediately. He uses it as a data point, the most concrete one he has. He requests a meeting with Claire. He comes prepared, not aggressive, not ultimatum-driven. Prepared in the specific sense of having done the work before entering the room. He brings a single document: his current compensation, the market range for his role, his tenure, and his scope, drawn from multiple sources, and a specific number he's asking for, one he arrived at independently before any outside offer appeared. He doesn't lead with the competing offer. He leads with the data. He explains his methodology. He presents the gap not as a grievance, but as a documented reality he'd like to address together. Claire goes quiet in a way that tells him everything. She didn't know he knew. The conversation that follows is the most substantive salary discussion Dan has had in 6 years at that company. Not because an outside offer forced anyone's hand, though it did clarify the stakes and compress the timeline, but because Dan had systematically dissolved the information asymmetry that the system depends on to function in the employer's favor. He knew the market number. She now knew that he knew. The comfortable fiction that 3% was a reasonable reflection of his value couldn't survive contact with a documented, specific, methodologically grounded reality sitting on the table between them. He receives a 14% adjustment, not the full gap closed, but the ceiling moves. And for the first time in 4 years, the number on the table is not just fine. This is the mechanism that most salary advice never names directly. The ceiling isn't broken by performance. You were already performing. It isn't broken by loyalty, or by patience, or by waiting for the right moment in the review cycle, or by making yourself indispensable and trusting that someone will notice and act. Those things matter for your career in many ways. They do not move the ceiling. The ceiling is broken by information, specifically by systematically closing the gap between what the company knows about your market value and what you know. When that gap is wide, the employer holds all the structural advantage, not because they're exploiting you, but because the system runs on that gap as a feature, not a bug. When you close it, the nature of the conversation changes entirely, not because you've become more valuable overnight. You were already valuable, but because the system can no longer rely on your not knowing. The 3% raise is not an assessment of your worth. It is, in a very specific and important sense, a test of your awareness. The company's opening position every year is whatever they calculate you will accept without a documented counterargument. Your position is whatever you know when you sit down at the table. The distance between those two things is the ceiling. And a ceiling, it turns out, only functions as a ceiling for people who don't yet know they're standing under one. Dan updates his spreadsheet every 6 months now, not because he's constantly looking for the exit. He isn't. He's not bitter. He doesn't resent Claire or the company. But he's internalized something that took him 6 years to learn through the slow accumulation of fine numbers and quiet distance. His compensation is a negotiation that never fully closes. There is no point at which the number becomes permanent, settled, or final. There is no moment at which the company will spontaneously audit the gap and correct it on his behalf. The system will offer what it calculates, he'll accept. It always has. It always will. The only variable is what he knows when he sits down. So now he knows. And now, so do you. If this video opened your eyes to something your employer was never going to tell you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more content that cuts through the noise and gives you the real mechanics behind money, work, and building wealth on your own terms, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you never miss what's coming next. The information is out there. We just make sure it finds you first.